Hello and welcome to your lecture for Module 2. Today we're going to talk about two different topics. The first is how our society has changed drastically. We're going to focus mostly on the 1950s to the present. And then after that topic, we're going to move on to common characteristics of abusive people. So two different topics to cover in our lecture. And of course, you're going to have other assignments in the rest of the module. Let's talk about the baby boomers. So the U.S. population exploded after World War II. It was the largest and fastest increase in the U.S. population in the history of the United States. So the baby boomers are the generation that were born between 1946 and 1964. So think right after World War II, right into the 1960s. This was also a period of unprecedented economic growth and wealth. It was a very prosperous time in the United States for most people. And children born during this period generally grew up with their married parents, with their mother and their father, and several siblings. It wasn't unusual during this time for a family to have 4, 5, 6, 7, or even more children. That was pretty common. Now, there's a lot of other things going on during this time period too, like systemic racism and a lot of really negative social issues. But none of that was talked about, right? So from the periods of the 40s and the 50s, you would not hear people openly talking in public or at the dining room table about issues such as homosexuality, poverty, sexual assault, domestic violence. All of those things existed, but they just weren't openly talked about. Your typical family in the 1950s, again, as we said, is a mom, a dad, and a couple of children. The definition of a family was much different then. The term family could have also included maternal or paternal grandparents, but generally a family was referred to as a mother, a father, and the children born to that couple, the children that they had in common. Divorce was very rare, and when it occurred, it carried a serious social stigma. So regardless of what income bracket you were in, to be divorced carried a lot of social shame. You could experience problems getting a job if you were divorced, especially if you were a female. A lot of social consequences. You could be cut off from friends and family members, from your religious institution. There was a lot of social shame around divorce, especially for women, but also for men. Issues such as teenage pregnancy, drug abuse, and alcoholism were not openly discussed. You would not open a newspaper in the 1950s and see an article about teenage pregnancy, nor would you see an article about people recovering from drug abuse and the various programs they were using to do that. These topics just were not discussed. Now, television is invented around this time and really starts becoming popular, and a lot of people own televisions in the 1950s for the very first time. Television's brand new, and television's a pretty happy place. Other than an evening news program, pretty much everything on TV is going to be very much about perfect people having perfect lives. You're not going to see a lot of shows about murders. You're not going to see a lot of shows where drug addiction or alcoholism is pictured. You're not going to see programs about families that are like sarcastic, where people are rude to each other. It's very much this fantasy of the perfect family, the housewife who stays at home and cooks all the meals and keeps this perfectly clean house, and the husband who comes home after work and pats the kids on the head, and everybody's pretty happy-dappy. And it's this very idealized fantasy of what's going on in most families. So all those issues they're not talking about are happening, right? People are suffering from alcoholism. People are violent toward each other. People are murdered, people are sexually assaulted, children are abused. All those social issues are going on. It's just not openly talked about. And on TV, you're never going to see any type of nudity, and you are never going to hear swearing. They're not even going to say damn in a TV show. And for many years in television, people were not allowed to broadcast even a husband and wife character sleeping in the same bed. I think the Brady Bunch was one of the very first shows that showed the mom and dad sleeping in the same bed. So like if you watch really old TV shows like I Love Lucy, Lucy and Ricky sleep in separate beds even though their characters are married, right? That's how conservative media is during this time. A lot of expectations on women and what women's roles are in the family. In your module this week, you're going to look at an article from a magazine called Housekeeping Monthly. You can see at the top of the page here, this was published on May 13th, 1955. So this is a women's magazine, largely dealing with homemaking and taking care of children and taking care of the home. And it's called The Good Wife's Guide. And what it does is it provides lots of helpful advice to women about how they should act in their home. Here's a couple highlights. One of them says, be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. His boring day may need a lift, and one of your duties is to provide it. Prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, and be fresh looking. He's just been with a lot of work-weary people. Clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives, right? You're going to look at a few more of these in the module. It's quite something, right? Probably not something we would see published in a magazine today. But it does give you a good idea of what the expectations were for women in the home. It was unusual in the 1950s for women to work. A woman at that time, it might be typical for her to volunteer at her place of religious worship or maybe volunteer at the children's school. But it was generally frowned upon to have women in the workforce. You'd seem a little, poor or maybe a little desperate if you were working. A lot of men preferred or even insisted upon their wife not earning any money at all. It was the man's place to earn the money, right? And the woman's job to keep the home and take care of the children. You'll see some more of this article in our module this week. And I don't mean to present this as life was really easy for men back in the 1950s, because it certainly wasn't. Now, a lot of these men are coming back to the United States after serving abroad in World War II, right? Serving in the United States military, World War II, horrible conflicts, horrible act of war, often battles where tens of thousands of men were killed in the same day, families devastated by that, entire neighborhoods, decimated by all the men in one neighborhood being killed in the same period of time. Just a really terrible time for men. We also didn't talk about things like post-traumatic stress disorder. That term had not even been invented yet. So our soldiers are coming back from serving in World War II. They are terribly traumatized. They've been exposed to acts of violence as a result of the Holocaust that are hard to even imagine. And they're brought back home and expected to just get a job and go back to work and act like everything's just perfect, right? You'd be frowned upon to seek therapy. You would be frowned upon from trying to get advice or help from someone else. You were just supposed to shove that all away and just move on like it never happened. So not an easy time for men either in the 1950s. Men were expected to be solely responsible for earning money for the family. And remember, a lot of these families are big, not uncommon for people to have 4, 5, 6, 8 kids in a family. And if your wife's discouraged from working and you're the man of the house, all that pressure is on you to provide for all of these people. Men were not encouraged to view their wives as equal partners, right? So that's a lot of pressure that the man has to deal with all the finances, taxes, the mortgage, paying for the home, taking care of every repair in the home. Like, that's an awful lot of pressure. And you're not supposed to complain about it, right? Because you're supposed to be tough and you're supposed to be manly and you're just supposed to take all this on without complaint. Men are expected to be very brave, very stoic, unemotional. Asking for help is largely viewed as a weakness. But we know, of course, men in the 1950s had a lot of serious issues, many of them impacted by having served in World War II and coming home with a lot of physical injuries, mental health issues that were poorly understood and never talked about openly. Never. So, not a very easy time for a lot of women and not an easy time for an awful lot of men. Here's an ad from a magazine from the 1950s for Chase and Sanborn coffee. And this image depicts what happens to a wife or what can she expect if she doesn't buy Chase and Sanborn coffee and she buys some inferior brand. And what you see depicted here is a husband with his wife splayed over his lap, and he's slapping her on the buttocks, spanking her as if she's a child. Men were encouraged by social and religious institutions to treat their wives as if they were children. That was a very common philosophy that women, they're not as intellectually superior as men are. They're not as capable. They're not physically as strong. They're not as brave or as stoic. So, you have to kind of treat them like kids. That was a very common perception back then. And the ad says, if he discovers you're still taking chances on getting flat, stale coffee, woe be unto you. So it's basically warning women, like, you don't buy this brand of coffee, and if you get smacked by your husband for it, well, you should have bought Chase and Sanborn coffee, right? Imagine a coffee company putting an ad like this out today, right? But this is very common. If you go on Google and you search for ads like this, you'll find numerous examples. This was very common. And then we're moving into the early and mid 1960s, and the biggest social change and one of the biggest acts of social change we've had in American history was the Civil Rights Movement, which was the organized effort led by Black women and men in the U.S. to end racial discrimination and prejudice. And although the Civil Rights Movement was begun by Black women and men to benefit Black people, an offshoot of the Civil Rights Movement was it encouraged a lot of other people to fight for equal rights, which included white women searching for equal rights at home and in the workplace and throughout society. It also really started a whole movement of people with a variety of physical and mental disabilities to also start fighting for their own equal rights, especially in areas of employment. So although the Civil Rights Movement started out to benefit Black women and men, the product of the Civil Rights Movement was a lot of other disenfranchised groups of people started going, you know what, we're going to use this example and we're going to benefit from the strides they've made to improve our own situations. And basically just people protesting and getting in front of the legislature and trying to have laws changed and have laws added that basically just ensure basic human rights and dignity for people, regardless of their gender, their race, their disability, or any other factor. Of course, that led to the offshoot of what was called the women's rights movement that happened in the 1960s. The controversy over the Vietnam War really came into play here. And for the first time in U.S. history, we saw a big rift in families between children and their parents. So older teenagers, 17, 18-year-olds who are being drafted to go to Vietnam, who are protesting the war and don't want to be drafted and don't want to be part of this military movement, are suddenly protesting against the Vietnam War, which their parents are largely very much in support of. So this created a huge generational rift between people in their late teens, early 20s, college-age people, and their own parents. It's also the first military conflict widely broadcast on American television. It's hard for us to imagine now that a war could take place anywhere in the world involving the U.S. military and that you wouldn't see coverage of it on TV, or all over social media, right? It'd be on your phone. You could watch military actions take place probably live while they're happening on your phone. But that was unheard of until the 1960s, right? Because televisions don't become really common in people's homes until the late 1950s. The Vietnam War is the first military conflict to happen after the advent of television. So now this very upsetting, controversial war is being constantly broadcast in people's homes. And it really starts creating this first division between generations of people, specifically children and their parents. And then we have some of the most terrible acts that have happened in American history happen in the 1960s. President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in April 1968. And Robert Kennedy is killed the same year, later that year in June of 1968. All of these acts were played and replayed on television. So the first time in history Americans are watching their own leaders being murdered on television. So this is changing what's happening in society. It's changing what people are talking about in their house. It's changing what people are viewing on television. It's changing the entire landscape of the way American people live. Which leads in the early 1970s to the very first domestic violence shelter. So Aaron Pizzey is credited with creating the first domestic violence shelter in the world, was actually located in England, and it was the very first agency known to focus on getting women out of abusive relationships. And that's a really important emphasis. Get them out of abusive relationships. Prior to this time, there were different social groups that helped women stay in abusive relationships, right? Trying to teach women how to be better wives and how to not upset their husbands, right? Can you imagine? But 1971, the very first shelter opened in England, and it gave women a safe place so they could leave their home and go to a residence and seek shelter from an abusive spouse. In 1974, just a couple years later, Pizzey published a book called Scream Quietly or The Neighbors Will Hear. This is the first book published that includes case histories of women who are victims of domestic violence. So Pizzey opens the shelter. Women start coming to this shelter. She starts hearing their stories and learning about what happens to them. And she uses their case histories to publish this book. So Scream Quietly or The Neighbors Will Hear, published in 1974, is credited with being the first book published about what we then called battered wives. Media coverage picked up on this. 1976, Ms. Magazine is the first magazine ever published with an image depicting domestic violence on its cover. So the first time a magazine in the United States has a victim of domestic violence pictured on the cover happens in 1976. This was incredibly controversial at the time. This was considered to be shocking. People protested stores and said this image shouldn't be displayed, right? Because if people are uncomfortable talking about domestic violence, they certainly don't want to see it, right? They certainly don't want to be exposed to a graphic representation of domestic violence when they're checking out at the grocery store and walking past the magazine rack. So the first time this was really pictured in the media as a photograph was in 1976. Let's focus for a minute on some terminology issues and talk about terms we've used over time. So the first term that was used was battered wives. This is a historical term. It was helpful to an extent at the time. The problem is it only focuses on wives, right? Battered wives doesn't include battered girlfriends, battered husbands, battered domestic partners, right? It only focuses on women who are married. And it focuses too much on physical abuse. And we're going to learn this semester about there are all different types of domestic violence, only one of which is physical violence. So battered wives is the first term used to describe this. It was a good start. However, it's too narrow because it only focused on wives, which means it excluded everyone but married women, and was too focused on physical violence, which is only one part of domestic violence. That term slowly evolved into battered women. So that's better than wives because it would also include, girlfriends and other types of partners, people who are dating, people who are living together. But the problem here is still it just focuses on women, and men are also victims of domestic violence. And again, this term battered is problematic because we talk about assault and battery. Battery is an act of physical violence. So it's leaving out all the other types of violence that can be committed from one person against another. So it's an improvement from battered wives, but still not great. That slowly evolves into the term domestic violence, which we always abbreviate DV, much more modern term, includes both men and women. But there's a little problem here. It focuses on domestic, and we use the term domestic, it always refers to the home, right? So domestic violence refers to violence taking place in a home. But you don't have to live with someone for them to abuse you, right? You could be dating someone. They could have their own house. You could have your own house. You could be dating each other, be involved in an intimate relationship. And the term domestic violence doesn't fit that perfectly, right? It also doesn't talk about what if you've broken up? What if you're no longer in a relationship with this person? Domestic violence as a term kind of implies you're actively in a relationship with that person when the violence occurs. So it includes men, which is good. So it's better than battered women. But domestic still kind of makes you focus on a home and that everyone's living together, which isn't always accurate. It excludes dating violence. It also excludes that you've ended a relationship and violence is still continuing. But DV is still a correct term. You are welcome to use the term domestic violence. I use it throughout our entire course, so you'll hear me use that often. The New York State office is the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. So it's OPDV, Office of Prevention of Domestic Violence. So that term is widely used. It's still a correct term. But it's slowly getting improved and melding into intimate partner violence. So that's the newest term used in this field. IPV is how it's abbreviated. This is a good term because it includes both men and women. And it also includes like a wide variety of relationships and conduct. So domestic violence is a correct term to use. So is intimate partner violence. You're going to see me using both throughout the semester. I switch back and forth all the time. But slowly, I think we're going to see over time the term intimate partner violence taking over. Now, our definitions of family have certainly changed a lot in the past 30 years, even in the past 10 years, right? It is not uncommon now for us to have single parents, right? We all know tons and tons of single parents. Divorce is very common. Legal separation is very common. People living together and not being married is very common. People having two moms or two dads is very common. Children being raised by grandparents or other relatives is common. Step parents, adoption, foster care, right? So we have a much broader concept of what a family is than we did even 20 years ago, much less in the 1950s. So here's some things to consider about that. Our families today are much more diverse than they ever have been, ethnically, religiously, and stylistically, right? So it's not uncommon these days for people of all different ethnic groups to marry, to intermarry, to share homes, not uncommon at all. It's much more common that people of different religious backgrounds marry each other and have children. And they're much different stylistically, right? I don't know too many families where someone doesn't work, right? And is just primarily staying home and taking care of the house, and the other partner's 100% responsible for the entire financial burden, right? That's much less common than it used to be. So even the style of our relationships is much different. Many more women today than any time in history are choosing not to have children at all. That was very uncommon. Even in the 1980s, it was pretty uncommon for women to just choose to not have children. Living together and not married has increased 170% just between the 1990s and 2012. So much more common than it ever has been. Women have the higher income in 40% of all families. That was incredibly rare in the 1970s. In the 1970s, only 10% of women had a higher income than their male husband. That was very uncommon. Now it's almost 50-50. 41% of all babies born today are born to unmarried parents. That's a huge shift since the 1950s. Couples average much fewer children. Many people choose only to have one children, two, or maybe three. Very unusual for these days for people to have 6, 7, 8, or more children. People are marrying when they're quite a bit older. Previous generations, it was very common for people to get married at 18, 19 years old. Much more common now for people to get married at 27, 28, 30s, even into their 40s or later. And divorce is much more common. Almost half of all first-time marriages end in divorce. That was unheard of in previous years. And we could spend half an hour talking about all these changes, right? These are just a few of the major changes to families. So why do we need a term to describe violence that occurs between people who know each other? Well, we need to have a term that encompasses a wide variety of behavior, from physical abuse to financial exploitation to sexual abuse, right? There's all different types of abuse. So we need a term that encompasses all of those different types of conduct. And we also need a term that differentiates violence in relationships from violent acts that occur between strangers. So for example, if I'm leaving Crossgates Mall by myself and a person comes up behind me, puts their arm around my neck, starts to choke me, grabs my purse and runs away, that's a crime, right? That's a robbery. That's a crime I can report to the police, but that person is a stranger to me. They don't live in my house. They don't know where I work. They probably don't even know what I drive. They probably don't even know, anything about me before they've taken my wallet and seen my ID, right? So once I leave that crime scene and I go home, I'm not exposed to that person again. I'm probably never going to see that person again unless criminal charges are done and we go to a trial and I see them in a trial, right? But I don't have to deal with them. I'm not related to them. They're not coming to my Thanksgiving dinner, right? They're not coming to my birthday party. I'm probably never going to run into this person. That's a much different thing than when someone is physically or abused in other ways by someone you're married to, you're living with, you own a home with, that you share children with. That's a much different thing. So we use the term domestic violence and intimate partner violence to demonstrate that the abuser or perpetrator has an intimate or familial relationship with the victim. So it's a much different type of crime than a crime being committed against someone by a stranger, right? They're both crimes. They're both very serious, but it's much different when you know the person who's committing a crime against you. You're going to look at a bunch of theories in the text this week about social stress, power, dependency, alcohol, pregnancy, and marriage all play a role in domestic violence. I'm going to let you cover that in the textbook. And I'm going to move on to our second topic, which is characteristics of partner abuse. In textbook, you're going to read about traumatic bonding. This is a fascinating topic. So someone with no knowledge of domestic violence or how it impacts people must think, well, if I was married to someone and they physically or sexually abused me, I would hate that person and I would never want to be around them again. And I would move out and I would never speak to them or see them again. Traumatic bonding is a really interesting concept that talks about how abuse actually connects you to someone. It's very interesting. Psychological entrapment is a similar concept. Social isolation and economic stress. I really want you to focus on this part of the assigned reading this week, these topics. Traumatic bonding, psychological entrapment, social isolation, and economic stress. And the chapter is going to cover a little bit the dynamics of battering. That's the term they're using, battering. It's kind of our initial look at the cycle of violence. This is just kind of a preview on this topic this week. We're going to spend a lot more time in the next couple of weeks talking about the cycle of violence. So just a little bit of a preview in the materials this week. Let's talk about common behaviors of abusive people. So we're not talking about victims, we're talking about abusers or perpetrators in this section. What characteristics do they have in common? Well, abusers often have a history of violence in their own family. Abusive people are frequently exposed to family violence during their own childhood. So either one of their parents is abusive to the other, they're exposed to abusive grandparents, they are exposed to a history of family violence in their own home. And frequently abusers come from homes where violence is accepted or even encouraged, right? So it's not considered unusual or bad for people to hit each other, slap at each other, scream at each other, touch each other inappropriately, touch each other without permission in a sexual way, right? It's very common in the family. It's accepted. It's even encouraged. It's joked about. It's not a big thing. So two characteristics of abusers or perpetrators is that they were exposed to family violence when they were growing up. Abusive people are often very jealous people. Now, any of us can be jealous, right? We've all experienced feelings of jealousy in our life about our partner or a prospective partner, right? They're looking at someone else, or they comment on how attractive someone else is, or they're, flirting a little bit, and we can feel jealous. That's perfectly normal. That's a human emotion. That's not what we're talking about here. The level of jealousy we're talking about in abusive people is constantly jealous over every little thing, right? If you even look at someone, you're walking through a store and you look at someone and make eye contact, your partner's jealous of that. Why are you looking at them? Are you flirting with them? Do you want to be with them? Do you want to have sex with them? Why are you looking at them, right? Just a mere looking at someone else. Texting someone, they're instantly jealous. They're constantly convinced that you're cheating on them, right? Unfounded accusations of cheating. A person comes home 1 minute from work, it's you're cheating on me. You should have been home 5 minutes ago. I know how long it takes you to get from work to get from home. You should have been here 5 minutes ago. You must be with somebody else. You're trying to be with somebody else, right? Like there's no basis for it. There's no evidence of cheating. It's unreasonable to believe the person's cheating, but they're just so jealous. They're just convinced even the most minor conduct is proof of cheating. And they get very jealous of the time their partner spends with other people, with friends, with family, or even being at work, right? So for example, you want to go hang out with your friend at the mall, just the two of you, and do a little shopping. And it's, why do you want to spend time with them and not me? You like them more than me. You love them more than me. You don't care about me. You don't respect me. Just because you just want to go to the mall and wander around with a friend, right? Really innocuous and innocent behavior ends up in accusations of cheating, right? So we can all be jealous. Everyone has human emotions about being jealous. That's not what we're talking about as a characteristic of abusive people. Abusive people can be hypersensitive. We're all sensitive. We should be. We're human beings. We have feelings. We're all sensitive, right? No one likes having their feelings hurt or being taken advantage of. But we're talking about a level of hypersensitivity, overreaction to even the most routine setback, right? So their partner goes to make them dinner and the French fries are burned and they flip out. They throw dishes, they overturn the table, they start screaming over burnt French fries, right? A child is crying and is upset and is throwing a tantrum, and the partner just loses their mind, right? Screaming at the kid, stomping out, refusing to help the kid, refusing to console the kid. They're just super hypersensitive, super strong reactions to even the most mild, everyday kind of inconvenience. And they tend to take on this philosophy that everybody's against them, that everybody in the world is out to get them. Everybody's against me. Everybody's trying to screw me over, right? Hypersensitive. So nothing wrong with any of us feeling feelings of jealousy or being sensitive. We all experience that. We're talking about being jealous and sensitive to an extreme level. Abusive people are almost always very controlling. They're one of the people that say, like, my way or the highway. And that's like their philosophy of life, right? That everything they do is the right way to do things. Their way is the only way. They tend to impose very strict rules on people that must be followed, right? You have to do the laundry. You have to do it this way. You have to fold my shirts precisely like this. The clothes have to be put away in a certain way. They have to be organized by color. And if you don't do it that way, I'm going to scream your head off, right? These very strict, random rules. They also have to make every decision. Minor decisions about where we go to dinner, the abusive partner gets to decide, up to major decisions where the child goes to school, right? They must make all decisions, minor or major, and they tend to be always right. They always think they're right. So we're not talking about, you like things done a certain way around the house. We all feel that way about certain things. We're talking about an overall philosophy of life that they're always right. They should always be in charge. They should get to make all decisions. Abusive partners are always isolating. This is probably one of the most common characteristics. And what I mean by that is the abusive partner insists on being with their victim constantly. No one's allowed to have time to themselves. No one's allowed to spend time with other friends or family or coworkers. You always have to be with the abusers. And they'll say things like, those aren't your real friends. They don't really like you. They don't really care about you. They just use you. I'm the only person who really cares about you. I'm the only person who really loves you. And then they often tend to do this kind of love bomb thing where an abusive partner will convince their victim it's us against the world, right? No one else understands us. No one else appreciates. It's just me and you. We only have each other. I would die if I couldn't be with you, right? That kind of super isolating. You always have to be with the abuser. They always have to know where you are. They don't want you spending time with anyone else. And it's you and them against the world. Mood lability. We all have mood swings, right? You can have a bad day, you can get up on the wrong side of the bed. Your day can start out great, something crappy happens, you can, be in a bad mood. We all have mood swings. But this is severe swings in mood, and they happen very quickly. So an abusive partner will come home, hey, how you doing? How was your day? My day was great. Mwah, kisses, hugs, love you. And 2 seconds later be in a rage. And 5 minutes after a rage be in tears. And 20 minutes later be okay again. So these extreme shifts in mood. And again, much like their hypersensitivity, their mood swings also cause them to have disproportionate response to events, right? So the most minor thing goes wrong in the house and they lose their mind and flip out. Or the victim in the relationship says something like, oh, you have dirt on your shirt. You should change your shirt. And they burst into tears, right, over the most minor thing. Blaming abusers blame people. They do not take responsibility for their own behavior. They blame everything that happens to them on other people. My boss is a jerk. This is your fault. The kids are the problem. The neighbors are the problem. Your father-in-law is the problem, right? They're always blaming other people for their behavior. They'll say things like, you made me mad, or you made me slap you, right? Listen to how that sounds. You made me mad. You made me slap you. That's literally saying what I did is not my fault. It's the other person's fault. If you didn't fill in the blank, I wouldn't have fill in the blank. So for example, if you didn't always make dinner late, I wouldn't have punched you, right? If you didn't refuse to have sex with me, then I wouldn't force you to have sex, right? It's not taking responsibility for their own behavior. And they always blame outside circumstances for all their problems, right? Well, I'm mad all the time because I have a terrible job, or I'm miserable because I don't make enough money, or I'm upset because of something that happened 5 years ago, right? It's never taking responsibility for their own emotions and for their own behavior. Abusers tend to have very rigid gender roles. This is a very common characteristic. So male abusers have feelings like men are supposed to be strong and brave and capable, and women are weak, childlike, and need a lot of direction. This is where we get the expression, a man's home is his castle, right? It's my house. We do what I say. I make all the rules. The man's in charge of the house. And I make the decisions because I make the money, right? That's a very rigid gender role for a male to say, well, I'm the breadwinner, I'm the one who makes all the money, therefore I get to make all the decisions. So male abusers tend to buy into these very rigid gender roles about what men are supposed to be and do and what women are supposed to be and do. And almost all abusive people are verbally abusive. So it's really important to remember, and we'll talk about all the different types of violence, that verbal abuse is also a form of violence. Being hypercritical, nitpicking on someone, just picking at them to death, being insulting, degrading, name calling. And a lot of times the abuser will say, "Oh, I'm just kidding. Why do you get so upset? I was just kidding. Sticks and stones will break my bones. What's your problem? Like, I was just kidding. It was just a joke. Lighten up. Why do you take everything so seriously?" Right? So that's a part of verbal abuse, all that name calling and constant criticism, screaming, and also at the same time not taking responsibility for it, right? "Oh, I was just kidding. You're upset because you take things too seriously," right? Not taking responsibility for their own behavior. So just to cover those again, common behaviors of abusive people, they come from a history of family violence. That's very common. Jealous, extremely jealous. Not normal every day. I felt jealous for a minute, but extremely jealous. Hypersensitive, controlling, isolating, very labile moods, right? Severe swings in mood. Blaming, not taking responsibility for their own behavior. Rigid gender roles, and verbal abuse. Those are, let's count them, your 9 most common characteristics of abusers. So that's the end of our lecture for the module. As always, you've got a lot more stuff to do in your module. You've got a couple more assignments you need to complete. Please let me know if you have any questions about the Module 2 material.